Hello, welcome to another essay, Reports from Out Dear Space. I am Danny, and I'm writing these essays in order to keep myself sharp and practice my writing. Today, I have an essay about lesbians and post-apocalypse stories, and I'm really excited to hear what you guys think. The written version of this essay is on my Substack, which you can find in my description below. I adore post-apocalypse stories. When I was a teenager, my dad and I rented the first 3 seasons of The Walking Dead from Blockbuster and watched them nonstop over the course of a week. It was the height of zombie obsession, and I was absolutely hooked on the gory, adrenaline-pumping, tough decisions that these characters needed to make. Shortly after, I moved on to the Hunger Games trilogy, which was similarly devoured. It will come as no surprise that the trilogy impacted me deeply, and I still reread it every summer. I was one of the teens that fell deep into a hole of post-apocalyptic media that was coming out at the time. Whether it was a knockoff zombie show or a knockoff Hunger Games authoritarian regime, you bet I was there. There's a deep catharsis in watching your heroes stuck in a situation that seems unbeatable and watching them fight like hell to make it out. Post-apocalypse media also serve as cautionary tales for how badly things can go if we don't get a hold of them now. This is my personal favorite brand of nightmare cautionary tales. At the end of 2025, the show Pluribus, written and directed by Vince Gilligan and starring Rhea Seehorn, captured my attention. Like many viewers, I am a huge fan of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. In particular, I was very interested in Gilligan's portrayal of female protagonists. I'm a huge fan of his writing when it comes to morally gray, deeply complicated women. They're often viewed as unlikable through the standard patriarchal lens in media, but I tend to adore them. And boy, did he deliver with Pluribus's main protagonist, Carol. Pluribus centers around Carol, a grumpy and miserable romantasy author who finds herself one of 12 humans who are immune to a virus that infects the entire world. The virus is no ordinary virus, and it turns humanity into a positive and peaceful hive mind that is dedicated to making the remaining 12 human beings happy, including Carol. In the process of the virus taking over the world, Helen, Carol's wife and singular friend in the world, dies. For the rest of the season, Carol dedicates herself to trying to save the world from the hive mind. She is led down many strange and misadventurous paths along the way as she tries to survive this new world alone. Pluribus is a fantastic example of modern media taking post-apocalypse storylines in really interesting directions that question what makes us human. And what do we really cling to in the face of destruction? That, combined with more queer characters entering the media landscape, creates a cocktail that feels as though it was specifically made for me. Although it does leave me with a couple of questions. In today's media, why is the protagonist at the end of the world so often a lesbian? What is it about the sapphic orientation that invites a durability through the destruction of pre-existing standards? And what is the purpose of portraying lesbians as unbreakable and immune to dying from these cataclysms? I should caveat here that I myself am a queer woman. I am thrilled that there is more queer representation in popular media, but I think we should also question why lesbians are being disproportionately shown in high-stakes situations. Why are so many popular lesbian depictions specifically about them existing in some sad, lonely situation? Why do lesbians get sad, slow, existential tales of decay, and queer men get steamy hockey sex? As another example of this phenomenon, I recently finished reading You Feel It Just Below the Ribs, a novel by Janina Matthewson and Jeffrey Craino. Jeffrey Craino is one of the creators of Welcome to Night Vale, if you recognize his name. You Feel It Just Below the Ribs takes place in an alternative history of the world where a global utopia-like society developed after the Great Reckoning, an alternative and much worse version of World War I. Part of this utopic society posits that all children are separated from their families at birth because families enforce authoritarianism. At the age of 10, children go through the aptly named Age 10 protocols, which erase their memory from the first 10 years of their lives. After this, they are prepared for adulthood and slotted into society appropriately. The protagonist and narrator of the novel is Dr. Miriam Gregory, who originally creates these mind-erasing techniques. She was born before the Great Reckoning, and most of the story records her life and regrets in developing the technique for what she considers to be super harmful usage. I adored the book. Obviously, it raised questions about society and blame that I thought were very pertinent given our times. I was also drawn by what it meant for Dr. Miriam Gregory to be a lesbian who inadvertently gives a powerful tool to an authoritarian regime, a tool that is not only used to change the world, but to change a core trait of humanity. Does her being a lesbian add gravitas to the story? There's a parallel here between a scientist lesbian versus an old crone or witch. We have fairy tales of women who live and create in isolation, and very often these women are framed as villainous. Miriam is a very lonely character throughout the novel. She states multiple times how she craves solitude and seems to always find herself in solitary situations. In The Last of Us, we have a similar situation with one of the main characters, Ellie. For those uninitiated, The Last of Us is a zombie video game that features Joel, a smuggler, and Ellie, who is a girl who is immune to the zombie virus. Their story in the first video game takes place as they travel across the devastated former United States together. In the first game, Ellie has a love interest in one of the DLC storylines, Riley. Riley is a girl who Ellie met and grew up with in Boston's quarantine zone, where they were always sneaking out and doing rebellious things. Unfortunately, Riley ends up getting killed by zombies, and it impacts Ellie greatly. Her first love was brutally murdered right in front of her. Riley is just the first in a long line of people who have cared about her and died. This impacts all of her relationships moving forward, and notably how she grows really close to Joel. In the second game, we watch as Ellie grows close to another character, Dina. Their love story begins with the two characters as obviously good friends, and they quickly grow to become lovers. By the end of the game, through a series of damning decisions, Ellie pushes Dina away from her, too haunted by her past to continue the relationship. Ellie is left in an empty house, alone and isolated by her decisions. Ellie being a lesbian is a deliberate choice by the writers, and it also feels really in line with her character and her demeanor. She is a great example of a queer character whose entire storyline isn't merely defined by being queer. That being said, the world she lives in is brutal. and it is constantly taking away her loved ones. She learns very quickly that the only way to survive in this world is to take on these masculine protection traits. Fight first and ask questions later. Viciously kill if you have to. Leave those who you cannot save. Leaning into these traits, and specifically the revenge that haunts her, is what ends up leaving her alone at the end of the second game. Alone, with no one to protect. I would be remiss to not also mention the comic My Experience with Lesbian Loneliness by Nagata Kabi. Although this autobiographical comic does not depict a post-apocalypse world as the other texts I preferred do, it does depict the end of the author's world, of her internal way of seeing things. Because Nagata cannot keep up with the intense demands of society, she is left behind by society and falls into a deep, dark depression. She is an example of the system not working and failing. Because of this, she is living in her own apocalypse that is contained within a corrupt society. It is interesting to see how many similarities the plot of Plurbius and My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness have in common. In both plots, the main character is desperately seeking connection through a world that does not fit them. I think there is a sort of intrinsic loneliness to being a sapphic person that all of these stories and all of these characters are ringing true about. In our society, it is prescriptive to venerate men. Men are usually the individuals in power and are definitely the ones in societal power. No matter how many male loneliness essays there are, we live in a patriarchal society, and men hold the power that creates this loneliness in the first place. As a society, we look up to and venerate men and masculine traits rather than feminine ones. Masculine traits are seen as generally admirable. Think of what we were saying before with Ellie, where she needs to protect the ones that she loves and fight for what she deserves. Whereas feminine traits are often seen as embarrassing. So where does this leave the lesbian? A woman who is supposed to worship at the altar of men who doesn't. Instead, she worships at the altar of people who are supposed to be embarrassing. Embarrassing may be an inaccurate term here, though, as it is the behavior in which women are expected to act. It is also the behavior that leaves them vulnerable to a marketable violence. For example, many gender non-conforming women experience some level of ostracization. Trans lesbians and trans women in general require conformity to a traditional femininity, otherwise they are labeled as predatory or ugly at best. Undoubtedly, it is great that queer media is becoming more popular. Regardless of the quality, it's frankly the quantity itself that is important to fill the gap of representation. I'm interested in these tales where the protagonist's queer orientation has a psychological undercurrent to the story, but it doesn't cause blatant real-life problems for them. They were gay, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was that society was collapsing. The character just happened to be gay during it. And as we know from many of these stories, the only people who are lucky and smart enough to survive society collapsing are the ones who are willing to think outside of the box. As feminism grows and we are entering an era where it's acceptable for people to grow old alone or at least have different fairy tale endings than the usual heteromantic kissing at the end screens, Why do we punish our lesbian heroes by forcing them to be alone at the end of a narrative? How often are we doing this to our heterosexual counterparts in post-apocalypse media specifically? Katniss and Peeta end up together at the end of The Hunger Games. Rick and Michonne end up together at the end of The Walking Dead. There are happy endings in this genre. So why do our lesbian protagonists never get them?